Hey everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop. So I finally have a new Outfeed table. I got the saw stop in the shop almost 2 years ago, and when I got rid of my old saw, I got rid of my old Outfeed table with it because that table was actually too tall for this saw. The saw is 3 inches shorter than my old table saw, and the miter slots are in different spacing. So at the very least, I have to replace the top on the old Outfeed table anyway. So I finally did it. I finally have an Outfeed table, and I've really missed having the storage and the functionality of things not falling off the back of the saw as I'm cutting them. So before we get into the build, I want to say a big thank you to Rockler Woodworking and Hardware for sponsoring this build. They provided all the hardware for the build, all the jigs to make the whole build go more smoothly, as well as a bunch of accessories to make the Outfeed table a lot more multifunctional in my shop. So let's get started. So I'm going to start by making the top, and I'll size the base to fit the top once I have this thing down to its final dimension, because I don't know exactly how wide it's going to be at this point. So this is a slab of ash that I cut a few years ago. I posted a video a couple of years ago on picking this log up and slabbing it in my backyard with a chainsaw, and I'll leave a link to that video if you want to check that out. So first off, I want to trim this thing down closer to its final length. It's still about a foot longer than it needs to be right now. On this end I have some kind of weird goofy thing where the log was cut, and then on that end I have some rot that I want to remove. So I'll go ahead and make those two cuts first, and then I have some defects that I want to start filling with epoxy. So I'm going to start filling defects here on this side, which is going to be the bottom. A lot of these cracks don't go all the way through, so don't have to worry about the epoxy pouring out the bottom, which is actually the top side. And over here at this rotted area, it is fairly hard, but it is kind of loose, and I want to stabilize this a little bit to make the flattening easier. So over there, I'll just pour on some epoxy and allow it to soak in. I'm not really worried about actually filling the defects so much as I'm worried about stabilizing them. So I'm not going to start working on filling the defects on this side, which is going to be the top side, but down here in this knot, there's a couple pieces of steel. I'm not sure if these are nails or some wire or something, but they're embedded in there, and I was going to pull them out, but I decided that I'm going to leave them in there and just epoxy around them. I think this is going to tell a little more of a story of this wood, and kind of, I cut the wood, I cut through here. I didn't know these were in here at the time, and they didn't do anything to my my chain or anything, but it's just kind of a cool memory I think I want to leave in there. So now on to get this thing cleaned up and flat. I've stabilized the slab on my flat assembly table with some shims, and I'll start making passes over it with my router sled. Now the router will work this thing down until the whole surface is flat, but I think what I'm going to do is flatten most of the bottom side, since I don't really need the whole thing to be flat or cleaned up, just mostly flat, especially in the areas of the contacts in the cabinet later on. And I think what I'll do is when I flip the slab over, I'll probably just flatten most of the top surface, of course avoiding that steel in there, but I think I want to leave some of the saw marks in the slab itself. I did something similar on the waterfall tables that I just built. I left some of those saw marks in there. I think it's kind of a cool effect, especially on the ones like this that were chainsaw milled. Those saw marks are a little more distinctive than, say, like a bandsaw mill. So I think it's just kind of a cool look, and just kind of gives a little bit of a nod to the fact that this was cut from a log with a chainsaw and didn't just come this way. I didn't just go down to the store and buy a slab. It was sawn out of a tree. Now that I have a better idea for the final size of the slab for the top, I can start working on the cabinet. So I went out and picked up a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood, which I used for the cabinet top, the bottoms, the sides, and the vertical divider. I also picked up 2 sheets of 1/2 inch plywood, which will become the cabinet back and the drawer boxes. The nice thing about cabinet work like this is that a lot of the parts have like the same width, so I can just break down the sheets into strips. I'll break down all 3 sheets into those various strips, and I'll set aside the 1/2 inch stock for now and just focus on the 3/4 inch stock for the carcass. For these ones, I'll break down those strips further before bringing them into the shop and then cutting them down to their final size with the table saw. So the outer joinery on this cabinet is going to be rabbets, so I'm setting up my dado stack with sacrificial fence to cut the exact width of the plywood thickness and about a 1/2 inch deep. So with those rabbits out of the way, I've adjusted my fence to make the rabbit in the back to the 1/2 inch plywood. And then once I'm done with this rabbit, the last thing to do would be to cut the dado in the top and bottom for that vertical divider. So I don't have a piece wide enough for the divider, but I do have this offcut that's twice as long as I need and half as wide. So I'll use that and some glue to make up the stock for the divider. That's efficient use of materials right there. Okay, so let's see how this thing fits together and get a final size for the back. So this is looking like it's ready to be glued up. Before I do that, I'm going to pop the back off and drill the shelf pin holes. The smaller cavity is going to receive some open shelves. That's going to give me some storage space right where the jointer is. I can't put drawers there or a door, but having some open shelves would be kind of nice to store, you know, whatever over there. And having the shelves in place will allow me to make better use of just having one big open cavity. So I'm going to use the shelf pin jig to drill the holes. This jig can also be used after the cabinet is assembled, but since I have the option of doing it before gluing it all together, I'll have a little more room to work from both sides. So everything looks like it's fitting pretty well. The back pops into place really nicely. So it's about time to get some glue on this thing, get it in the clamps, and get it all glued up. Cool. Square. Ah! So that takes care of the plywood cabinet construction, and the next thing I want to start working on is the facing. So that'll be the edge banding for all of the edges of the case as well as the drawer fronts. And the material for that I have is some box elder. Got a bunch of this stuff that I might as well use up for this project. I have some really nice boards that have some really nice flame to them and a little bit of curl that I'm going to use for the drawer fronts. But I do have this guy here, which is a little more on the boring side, and I'm going to use this one to make all of the edging for the cabinet. So I'm going to start breaking this one down into the strips. They'll become the edge banding material for the top, bottom, sides, and vertical divider. So this will get milled down to the thickness of the plywood, which is around 23-30 seconds, and then it'll be cut down to 3/4 of an inch wide. To install the edge banding, I'll apply glue and use some tape to help kind of clamp things in place. Then I also have these bandy clamps from Rockler, which will provide a lot more downforce than the masking tape does, and really do a lot of the clamping while the tape kind of holds things in place. I'm starting with the sides since they're running all the way from top to bottom. Then I'll cut to fit the top and bottom piece, and then I'll cut and fit the divider, which will fit between the top and bottom. So now with this thing flipped upside down on the bench, I'm going to start adding the base hardware. I have a leveling foot as well as a caster. The leveling foot is going to be great for getting it stationary and getting the whole cabinet up to the right height, so it's the right height for the table saw, but you can also drop it down to the casters when you want to wheel this thing around, which is super convenient. So because the casters obviously add a lot more height than these guys, which are meant to go onto the side of the cabinet like that, I put together this little razor block thing, or riser block. That's just made from some more of that scrap box elder that I made the edge banding from. And these are just joined together with some really fancy steel dowels that are serrated and have a fancy decorative head. So I want to get the leveling foot out to the outside here, and I want to put the casters in behind here to keep them as wide as possible, to keep as much stability as possible there, instead of moving them over here because they'll be too close together and this thing will be really tippy as you try and wheel it around. For a deeper cabinet, that wouldn't be a problem. You can put the casters out on the side, but I'm going to put them over here so I have a little notch out of the bottom here so that the caster sits as close as possible to the riser. So with all that said, I can attach the risers to the cabinet and attach the leveling feet and the casters to the cabinet. The risers just get attached with some glue, and I'll also add a couple risers in the middle above the vertical divider, and that'll support the center of the cabinet so it doesn't have a tendency to sag. And while I have this thing flipped upside down, I'm going to drill the holes to the top, which will allow me to connect the actual top, the slab top, to the cabinet. So the cabinet portion is all done, so now because I'm working on the drawers, so it's back to the plywood. So I'll start by ripping the strips that will become the sides and fronts of all of the drawers. Now my bank of drawers is graduated, so no two drawers have the same height, so I'll be cutting different strips for every single drawer. And once I have those strips made, I can cut them up into the individual pieces for each drawer, the two sides, and the front and back. Now the joinery for the drawers is going to be exactly the same as the joinery for the cabinet. The front and back will get rabbeted to receive the sides, and then all four of those pieces will get rabbeted on their bottom edge to receive the drawer bottom. This makes for a really strong box because the whole thing is glued up, the bottom is glued in there as well, and the bottom itself helps us square up the drawer as you're putting it together. This method also makes it really easy if you're using any kind of drawer hardware because the front and back are cut to exactly the right size, so there's no kind of guesswork or trying to add in the thickness of the sides or a joiner or anything. If the front and back pieces fit between the two drawer slides, that's exactly the fit you're going to get once the drawer is assembled. Before I assemble the drawers, I'm going to start the installation of the drawer slides. Something I like to do is to install the drawer boxes into the case immediately after I do the initial assembly, letting the glue dry while the drawer box is inside the case. And that's just going to make sure the drawer will actually fit nicely into the opening, and if there's any kind of weird racking or out of squareness of the case, either from the case itself or due to the slides or anything like that, the drawer is going to conform to that geometry and it's going to operate nicely and flawlessly. Now the actual assembly on the drawers is pretty easy. Just apply glue to all the rabbets and I'll pin everything together with a pin nailer. And with those slides already installed in the case, I can go right from the assembly table and install that drawer box directly into the case. This also makes it really easy to store the drawers while the glue is drying because they're out of the way and I don't have a bunch of drawer boxes laying around my shop as the glue is just sitting there waiting to dry. So with all the drawer boxes all assembled and installed, next we can move on to the facing that'll go on the fronts of these drawer boxes to hide the hardware and make the whole thing flush with the front surface of the whole cabinet. So for that I have some more box elder. I think these might be cut from the same tree as the edge banding, but these two boards were cut from the same log. I have one that was edged and one that has a live edge. This one here has a lot more color and interesting things going on. I'll be able to get the whole bottom drawer front as well as I'll be able to get both the first and second drawer front by splitting a board in two. So we'll have a continuous grain for the top two drawers, and then for this third drawer here, I can get that out of this guy here, which doesn't have as much color, but does have some interesting kind of like bird's eye kind of effects going on here. So I think this will still be interesting in its own right. So I'll get these boards kind of laid out, rough broke down, and then get them all milled down and start getting these things cut to fit to all the openings, get them attached to the drawer fronts with all the appropriate gaps and space between each drawer front, and I think that'll be about it for the cabinet section, with the exception of installing the handles or the pulls on the actual drawers. So to get the drawer fronts fitting correctly and the gaps around the outsides nice and even and consistent, I have a few shims that I'm going to use as spacers. So as I work my way through the drawers, I'll put the shims down on the previous drawer front or the bottom in the case of the bottom drawer, cut one end of the drawer stock nice and square, set that in place, get the gaps on the sides correct, and then just mark the location of the cut on the other end. So once that cut is made, I can double check to make sure that the width is correct. Then I can clamp the drawer front to the drawer box and install it with a few screws to the back. And then I'll just continue this process until I've installed all of the drawer fronts. This is looking really good. Well, that's open. This is looking really great. I am super happy with the look of this color on here. It just looks absolutely beautiful. Now normally with this kind of stuff, all the shop furniture, I take more of a utilitarian approach to things. I'm a little bit on the pragmatic side. I would not apply finish to shop furniture because it's shop furniture, whatever. But I think there's a lot of cool colors in here, so I'm leaning towards actually applying finish to this thing for the first time in my shop furniture history. But this is about it for the whole cabinet construction. Now I can take this thing over to the table saw area and start working on getting the top attached and start working on all of the stuff that's going to go into the top itself. So So I spent some time out here with my card scraper last night, just having some fun. I had a little bit of tear out here on the top that I still need to clean up a little bit. But more importantly, I got the slab situated and oriented on the cabinet exactly as I want it to be. So now it's ready to be attached to the actual cabinet. So I can transfer the hole locations that I had drilled previously from the cabinet to the underside of the slab and then drill the pilot holes in the slab. I'm going to attach the slab with some 1/4 bolts, so I'll tap the holes in the underside of the slab to receive those bolts, and I can replace the slab onto the cabinet and bolt it in place. So before I get too far ahead of myself, I just remember I still need to cut the slab down to its final length, get those ends trimmed up and cleaned up, even though it doesn't really matter, I guess. So with the bolts installed, just like 2 of them to align it, I'm just going to mark out where the cabinet is on the slab so I can make the cuts nice and parallel to the cabinet. Now in reality, it doesn't really matter what the angle on the end is or if the overhang over the sides is the same on both sides or from front to back. It doesn't really matter. It's an outfeed table. It's not that big of a deal, but I might as well make it look somewhat nice. So next up are the relief cuts for the miter slots. So right now as is, if anything was in the miter slots here and came off the back of the saw, it would contact the tabletop and you wouldn't be able to push whatever you're using through the saw. So to get these things laid out into the correct position, I spent a little bit of time getting the tabletop, or the whole table, exactly where it needs to go. So I have the left to right position set, I have the front to back position set, and I also used the leveling feet to bring this table up to the correct height for the table saw. So to transfer the location of the slots to the table, I'm just going to stick these pieces of T-track in the slots and just trace out the outline of where they would go. Now I do want to make these slots a little bit wider, just going to be a lot easier to reposition this table if you ever move it, if that slot is a little bit wider than if it's like super tight and like a precision fit. So I'm just going to roughly eyeball this. I'm just going to use this T-track as a straight edge and just extend it maybe about 1/8 of an inch on each side. Now the other thing with these slots is they don't need to go all the way across the whole table. They can stop, halfway or somewhere in there. And to figure out where that's going to be, I have my crosscut sled here. And I'm just going to see where this thing kind of ends up if I were to totally make a cut. Right about there. So this is the kind of end point. So one last thing I'm going to do to the top is install some T-track. This will give me a little more flexibility with the surface, allow me to clamp things down to the surface, use it as a little more of a multi-function area than just a straight, boring, horizontal surface. So I want to install a piece of track along the front edge and then one along the side edge at a 90-degree angle to each other, just to give me some more flexibility there with things I can do here if I want to do some assembly here or something like that. So since I don't have any straight edges to reference off of, I can't just run the whole tabletop over my table saw, for instance. I'm going to screw down the T-track in exactly the right position so I can make sure it's exactly square, and then I'll route the dados for each of the T-tracks. I'll butt 2 straight edges up against the T-track, remove the T-track, and then use a pattern bit in the router to route a perfectly sized dado for that T-track exactly where that T-track is going to go. So I did end up deciding to apply a finish to the outfeed table. So I went ahead and took everything apart. And I'm just going to apply 2 coats of armor seal to the table just to mostly bring out the color. I don't really want to build a huge film finish on this. I also don't want to be applying finish for a long period of time. So just a couple of coats is really all this is going to need. That first coat is going to be a good seal coat. It's going to bring out the colors. And the second coat will just be just to kind of even things out to make the sheen a little more even overall. So I'm looking forward to getting some finish onto this thing because I think a lot of the pieces of wood on this outfeed table are really going to pop when they see some finish. So I got this whole thing reassembled and I added these poles which I think look pretty nice up against the box elder. And I think overall this thing is just looking pretty awesome. It makes being out here in the space a lot more welcoming, and I just feel good being out here creating things. And it's really nice to have the Outfeed support again. I've gotten so used to things falling off the back of the saw. I didn't really know what I was missing, so not having to worry about that anymore is certainly a really nice plus. Now in the top drawer of the cabinet I have all of the T-Track accessories, so if I need to do anything with the T-Track, all that stuff is right there. This is something else I'm really looking forward to. In the past, this area has been a lot more multifunction for me. This is the area where I work on my chainsaws and things like that. So having different ways to clamp things for that is going to be super nice. So having the casters as well as the leveling feet on the bottom of the cabinet in a shop like this is super handy. For me at least, I don't move the stuff around that often, but when I do or when I have to, being able to drop these things down into the casters makes moving these things so much more convenient. I have the same exact setup on my assembly table. I've had that there for like 5 years now. I have not put it onto the casters to move it around ever, but the day I have to is the day I'll be really happy that I added those casters to the bottom of that cabinet. One thing I did to make it easy to put these things back if either of them ever move is on the floor I just drew out an outline of where the leveling feet are with some permanent marker. I also drew out the outline of the table saw. And of course, since the miter slots are oversized, they don't have to get back into exactly the same position, but those little markings on the floor make that process just a little bit easier. So I think that's about it for this one. Thank you again to Rockwood for sponsoring this video. There'll be links to everything you could possibly want in the description down below. So, thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments on the Outfeed table, anything here in my shop, please feel free to leave me a comment. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Until next time, happy woodworking.